I'm delighted to see new friends and old faces at the same time present here today. And thank you for those of you who have stayed with me for the long haul, and for those who've dipped in and out. And I have to give credit to the media team here, who not only managed to overcome my own technological ignorance in figuring out the interface for my PowerPoint system, but also for a very high production value on the video recordings that they make and make available through the Frobenius-Institut website. So it's really nice to be part of that archive, actually. I mean, once you start going into archives, it's archives all the way down. So as Professor Hardenberg said, today we juxtapose this lecture in relation to last Monday, where we went on a bit of a magical mystery tour and entered the Yoruba ritual archive just to get a sample of it in terms of the ideas of history and the kinds of mechanisms of historical retrieval that were activated and are activated through various ritual media. And today I'm going to flip the coin and look at, it's a little bit of a kind of semi-scandalous history of Frobenius and his archive, mediated as it is through a lot of different ideological lenses, but primarily through his own. We have a very fortunate opportunity to analyze something that usually gets left out of ethnographies or ethnological accounts, and that is the actual exchange relations the ethnographer engages with assistants. Used to be called informants, but it sounds a bit like the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, so we don't call them informants anymore. And when people say they want to interrogate something in their theoretical perspective, I always have a view of somebody interrogating a prisoner. So I don't ever use that word unless I'm actually interrogating a prisoner, which I don't do. So in any case, my reading is based primarily on Frobenius's text in relation to some of the archival records I was able to consult in October. And his own narrative is very interesting, and what we're going to do is look at the aspects of ritual that underscore and underlie the making of his archive. And I should just point out, because I don't discuss this very much in the paper, that as you may well know, and you may not know, Frobenius's the financing of his expeditions occurred from multiple sources, including the former Kaiser, but the primary fundraising mechanism was for him to collect objects of art. He called them curios in his record to devalue their price and to make it less controversial. But he was selling his collected objects to ethnological museums in Hamburg, Leipzig, and Berlin. So when he engages in collecting, it's not simply to collect data or material, it's also to fund his expedition. So that adds an economic aspect to the exchange relations that he engages, and it helps explain why he needed to collect more than one would think an ordinary ethnographer would be compelled to do. So let me launch in now. I know, as usual, I have too much here, but I've pre-selected cuts, so when my alarm goes off, I'll just cut to the chase. During my fieldwork in Nigeria, before the era of smartphones, if some of you might remember that era, others of you don't. Before the era of smartphones, with their built-in flashlights, the small battery-powered penlight was an important nocturnal device for navigating narrow pathways between residential compounds, avoiding open sewers, or finding one's way to the toilet when NEPA no day, that is, when the Nigerian Electric Power Authority went dark. And I know that Ricard Kuva knows plenty of NEPA no day experiences from his days in Nigeria. Cheap flashlights from China were already available in Aiede's rural market, but they were unreliable at best. which is why on one of my KLM return flights to Lagos via Amsterdam, I splurged on a slick, high-end mini Maglite penlight made from beautifully crafted gunmetal, replete with engraved screw cap, Duracell batteries, and extra miniature light bulbs. I loved this specialized navigation aid. It became part of my personal come professional kit, along with the notebook, the sunglasses, the tape recorder, the camera, the cola nuts, the lighter, and the Bensons, as in Benson and Hedges, in my backpack that kept me physically and psychologically grounded. We all smoked in those days. The devil of fieldwork is in the details. One day, while working with Jide, one of my research assistants, I noticed my treasured penlight inside his shirt pocket. How could that be? I checked in my nearby writing desk, and indeed, it was gone. I turned to him. Jide, kilo de, where did this thing where you damn for pocket? Oh yeah, me lenu. This one not be tifo. So what I basically was saying is I was ripping into him for pilfering, for stealing my penlight, for violating the sacred bonds of trust that we routinely professed, knowing full well that it was always subject to qualification. To which he replied, Mr. Andrew, I thought you were my friend. How could you do it? I was caught off guard. Was he blaming me? I took my penlight and I asked him to explain how could I have offended him. He replied, you tempted me. You left it out. You tempted me. I thought you were my friend. So another light went on inside my head. It was my fault for tempting him because any friend who allows an opportunity like that for another friend is asking for trouble and deserves to be punished. This was axiomatic, not personal. It was my fault for putting him in this compromising situation because he did what anybody else would do, as should be expected, and I should have known. How could I be so inconsiderate and disappointing? So now I have to show you, there it is. I just found this while I was having a coffee downstairs. It's still the same penlight today that it was in 1984. It's 40 years ago? 30 years ago, 84. 40, oh God. Okay, another decade goes away. That's it, that's the same penlight. And it's got a solidity to it, yeah. So anyway, I think I put it in the wrong place, so I'm going to go back here. So the penlight affair was another reversal that opened my eyes to the default settings, what Habermas calls the normative grounds of Yoruba intersubjective communicative action. The tables suddenly turned as the accuser became the accused in Jide's deftly executed counterattack. If our friendship never fully recovered, I duly readjusted my expectations, bearing in mind the Yoruba proverb, "Eni afe l'amo, amo eni tofeni." We know who we love, but we don't know who loves whom or who loves us. That is, we never really know who our friends are. Even your own mother is often what is said in English after that proverb is offered. And it pushes the point to its ultimate limit. Even your own mother could be a witch. She could be someone who's taking your life. So I mention this here to illuminate the complex and finely calibrated rules of reciprocal exchange, which Leo Frobenius also navigated, negotiated, and sometimes egregiously violated during his fourth German inter-African expedition when, from September 1910 through January and a little bit of February 1911, he amassed, by my count, thanks to the archive downstairs, 1,402 Yoruba ritual artifacts for his museum sponsors. And he filled dozens of ethnological notebooks to establish what would become a classic, if problematic, reference work for Yoruba art history and ethnography. However, it is not the content of this remarkable collection that I wish to consider, at least extensively, in this fourth and final lecture, but the way Frobenius acquired it, by pushing limits, pulling strings, turning tables, and even spilling blood to achieve his goals. Frobenius was a master negotiator in the complex calculus of challenge and riposte that governs Yoruba bargaining strategies, and the fact that he documented his transactions in considerable detail in volume 1 of his now Voice of Africa, und Afrika-Sprach, I guess, allows us to reconstruct the ritual foundations of what became his Yoruba archive. The story is not always pretty. but the plot speaks volumes about the history and politics of acquisition, dispossession, substitution, and exchange in Afro-European colonial encounters. In what follows, I focus on two critical turning points in Frobenius' Yoruba campaign, prosecuted as it was in both scientific and militaristic registers under the watchful authority of the nascent British Protectorate. The first concerns his initiation into the Ogboni Society, or Bund as he called it, in the city of Ibadan. The second involves his literally groundbreaking acquisition of the bronze Poseidon Olokun head that became the capstone of his Yoruba Atlantis theory in the sacred city of Ile-Ife, triggering an official inquiry from 12 to 17 December 1910 that investigated allegations against Frobenius that he stole or otherwise illegally obtained it. Taken separately, these two turning points reveal overlapping jurisdictions that governed Frobenius' movements and renegotiated terms of exchange. Taken together, they delineate the fetishized framework of his archive of Yoruba culture. So the first section, and there's two sections in this paper, is called Deep Knowledge and Ritual Murder. One of the biggest surprises regarding Frobenius' research in Yoruba land, documenting traditions and acquiring artistic curios, was how much he was able to collect and accomplish in only 3.5 months. Anyone conducting research in this area, especially on topics that are safeguarded by secrecy, knows that progress remains slow at best because time itself is a valuable commodity and must be invested to garner returns. During my own research in the 1980s, it took about 12 months before I earned enough trust to gain any meaningful access to the Orisha cults, and another 14 before I felt I had collected about 10% of what I needed to write a proper dissertation. And as I mentioned before, even though I felt that way, it proved not to be true. I also learned that asking direct questions such as, what is inside Yemoja's calabash? Or, how do you initiate a new devotee? Was the quickest way to have the door slammed shut in my face. In fact, when I first realized that the secrets must forever remain secret, I readjusted my focus away from secrets themselves toward the socially organized barriers through which they were differentially incorporated into restricted levels of public access. I likened this new approach to making graphite rubbings of tombstones or coins to reveal the social contours of secrets from an exterior perspective, a liberating shift that improved my relationship with the priestesses to the extent that they thereafter decided when I was privy to restricted knowledge, typically in fragments. You know what these rubbings are? Do you do that on gravestones? You have a charcoal pencil and then you put the paper over and then you rub it and then suddenly the letters appear. That's how I thought about secrecy. Don't concern now for the content, just document when the response is simply no entry. When the response is awoni, it's a secret. That's data. That was a breakthrough for me. One common narrative, So my question is really, so the new method that I came up with took time. It took hours, days, months of helping out and hanging out, accompanying them through 2 annual festival cycles with camera, tape recorder, and notebook. I called this the method of prolonged osmosis, of spending time to allow whatever knowledge and information that could soak through the barriers that over time became semi-permeable membranes. So how did Frobenius cover so much ground in so little time? It was really astonishing how much he did. One common narrative attributes Frobenius' success to the violence of colonial appropriation and extraction, and judging from the self-portrayals of his own trickery and bullying in The Voice of Africa, corroborated by archival records generated by the Court of Inquiry held in Ife at the time, a little later, Frobenius' pugnacious character and tactics should never be underestimated. He was, after all, the man whom Wole Soyinka described as a racial slanderer and a notorious plunderer, one of a long line of European archaeological raiders, quote unquote. Moreover, Frobenius' expeditionary team both mounted and on foot, was something of a force majeure, with Karl Ariens, the painter-illustrator, Albrecht Martius, the engineer-excavator, a company of African cooks, porters, translators, also equipped with cash, Gertz cameras, firearms, whiskey, and cigars. Clearly, such an occupying force, effectively deployed, could generate quick results. But, like many characterizations of colonial situations and encounters, this one underestimates the considerable agency of Africans in both shaping and controlling such interactions. In the early days of the Yoruba expedition, Frobenius describes deals that broke down during complex dramas of aborted exchange in which his Yoruba counterparts gained the upper hand. And I'll quote about one right now. A typical case, he writes, followed by several more, occurred at the outset. One evening, he says, a poor boy had sold me a choice antique oracle tray for 15 shillings. 2 days afterwards, he came back with a suite of 10 or a dozen grizzlepates. I had to look that up, but in English even, it refers to gray-haired old men, which is a very condescending way to refer to elders who really occupy a status that unfortunately elders don't quite achieve in Western societies to the same extent, but it's a very rude way to put it. Put the money down on the table and they demanded the tray back. I did not, of course, agree offhand, and at once declared that a bargain was a bargain. And different ideas of contract and exchange are already clashing, right? Accepting this decision, the company departed, but returned the next day and told me that the tray had been stolen from a kinsman and that consequently I had no legal title to it. At the time, I was not sufficiently wide awake. I walked straight into the trap, delivered them a fine lecture on ethics, and gave them back the piece. A few days later, it transpired that the whole business had been a fraud. The young man had not stolen the tray at all, but had inherited it from his father, and the matter had been put to me in the manner described in order to persuade me to return the tray. I also heard that the lad had been given 20 shillings in return for promising not to sell the goods again, so that they might be kept in the family. It's very important, kept in the family. Frobenius goes on to describe, quote, as frequently happened on other occasions, unquote, how the same tray was offered to him 4 days later at the reduced price of 9 shillings, portraying himself, as had Frobenius, as the final winner of this convoluted negotiation, while acknowledging that he, quote, always had to reckon with the chances of kinsmen reclaiming the family property, that is, after concluding business with a seller. What Frobenius misperceives as the unscrupulous character and treacherous mendacity of the typical Yoruba seller reflects his perhaps willful misunderstanding of the kinship relations governing the devolution, the inheritance, the transfer down of family property, and prohibiting its sale, particularly when it comes to sacred possessions that protect and perpetuate households and lineages. In the passage quoted above, Frobenius fails to understand that selling an Ifa divination tray inherited from father to son is already a violation against kin and constitutes an act of illegitimate exchange. The fact that the seller's lineage elders, whom Frobenius lampoons as grizzlepates, a pate in English is the head, by the way, it's a slang term, you may not know it. I hardly know that term. Anyway, the seller's lineage elders paid the errant lad 20 shillings to ensure against future illicit sales. And that fact underscores the protected status of cult objects as what Annette Weiner calls inalienable possessions, set apart from commercial pathways of commodity exchange. Nor are such prohibitions restricted to families and lineages, but extend to the more inclusive corporate levels of wards and towns over which the Orisha cults hold broader ritual jurisdiction. I mention this because the second big incident, which I'm calling the Olokun affair, concerns the entire town sacred city of Ife. As we shall see, such transgressive conversions of sacred relics into commodities would come back with compound interest to bite Frobenius when his entire expedition was investigated by the British for allegations of coercive purchasing and outright theft. In the meantime, however, and by the way, he didn't steal anything outright, but these are the idioms that are used to mark the exchange as illegitimate. In the meantime, however, as his collection in Ibadan grew, Frobenius was hamstrung by another set of barriers blocking access to the secrets of what he calls the religious articles themselves, that is, to nothing less than Yoruba religion as a systematic theology and the rituals in which the articles were used and made sense. So he's now complaining it's not only hard to get the goods, but when you do get the goods, it's very hard to make sense of what people are telling you, what they mean. And I can attest to that. It's a very, very confusing, just to hear the polyvocality, the many different voices that say often very contradictory things about everything sacred, basically. Quoting him, "The fact remains that these good people gave me as overweight, so to say, to the articles I collected, such a mass of contradictions and variations that their explanations only made confusion worse, confounded. I got hundreds of names and hundreds of explanations. They were all mutually contradictory." It does tend to overstate a little bit. "Not only had I made absolutely no progress whatsoever after a fortnight's study, but had even lost the scanty landmarks previously gained." I have to laugh at Frobenius' presumptuous expectations when I recognize how similarly I felt a full 12 months into my research, with my mounting collection of photographs and cassette recordings and little idea of what it all meant. On the other hand, after consulting Frobenius' field notes from this 2-week period, I credit him for having elicited as much as he did, evidence more from his sketches, diagrams, and lists of Yoruba deities than from what, as I've said earlier, even Germans complain is his notoriously unreadable handwriting. And I want to just give you an example of, on the one hand, this is the sort of very quickly sketched note-taking. On the left, most of these terms are actually Yoruba, and I can recognize them, even though they have a different orthography than what is used today. And this is a little sketch of the Edan Ogboni. And the Ogboni societies very quickly started playing a very important role in his research. And what I've just done on the right side here is to give you a little sense of these small notebooks and how someone like me can still make use of them with assistance by identifying just the names. We have Ifa divination here. I can see here that with reference to Tapa equals Shango. Shango's mother comes from Tapa. He's actually working through the mythohistories of the different orishas. And he's got powerful cowries with Ashe here. Here's another reference to Orisha, and then 2 references to Ogboni here. So even just a cursory run-through reveals a very perspicacious ear and eye, a very impressive concatenation of details, and he didn't have a secondary literature to help him as a frame of reference. He became that secondary literature. So I really do take my hat off to him for whatever, it's a complicated, ambivalent situation. He had a complicated, ambivalent personality, but just to sort of dismiss him as a sort of parody of colonial violence, I think, is makes a missed opportunity of many other sides of him. There's my pen light again. Okay, and here's another sketch he has of the Edan Ogboni, which we'll see become quite important in his work. This presumably done by the artist Karl Ariens. So that being said, Frobenius' solution to the closed logic of the secret, the fact that he was locked out of it, was anything but osmotic, just the opposite. Grabbing the bull by the horns, as was his way, he engineered his own initiation into the Ogboni society, thereby turning the ritual vectors of access to deep knowledge in his favor, and unwittingly inaugurating what James Clifford identifies as the initiatory paradigm in ethnographic writing, associated with the French Africanist Marcel Griaule. If the paradigm for Clifford remains an enabling ethnographic fiction as the key to a unified conception of West African cultures, and he writes about Frobenius himself in this very important article. In Frobenius' case, it was predicated on sacrifice and ritual murder. The Ogboni Society is a classic secret society, its members bound together by a blood oath of primary loyalty to Onile, goddess and owner of earth, before all other affiliations, including family ties. Here again, even your own mother. When you get initiated, part of your oath is that if the Ogboni Society orders you to basically take out your own mother, you have to do it. And I don't think this was actually done, but it's a sort of, linguistically, it expresses the degree to which one's primary sort of blood affiliation shifts to the Onile, to the earth. It's not your mother anymore. And then in addition, you have to swear vows never to betray one another or leak the society's secrets on pain of death. Given the iconography of its ritual sacra, especially the iconic Edan Ogboni, brass figurines of a man and woman connected by a chain atop iron prongs stuck in the ground, that's the image up there, I suspect that the Ogboni kidnapped victims to sell into slavery, in addition to their judicial functions as guardians of the land and executioners with power to order a king to commit suicide. And those two things actually go together. You could order somebody to death and then they would disappear and they would be sold into slavery. And this particular notion of heads being chained to each other, I don't know if it's fair to say this, but I do think that given other evidence about secrecy and invisibility at the center of Ogboni's oath-taking, I do think it's clear. In these capacities, they are sometimes considered the real power brokers in Yoruba land, with regional networks extending between their lodges, called Iledi, that enable them to strike from long distances, thereby occupying a shadow space somewhere between upright citizens and ruthless mafias. Frobenius was clearly inclined toward the latter view of the Ogboni Society, dubbing it the Decapitation Company Limited. He does have some kind of a sense of humor. Comprised of a union of unscrupulous persons who, without the least qualms of conscience, get rid of all inconvenient elements, like a Vemheret. I don't know if I pronounced that right. This is his, and I had to look that up, and I see that it's a kind of historic court and association. With poison or the knife, they exterminate respected parvenus, confiscate their possessions, and pull the strings which make the principal civic power, the ballet in Ibadan, dance like a marionette at their behest. Since Ibadan developed as a military camp during the mid-19th century internecine wars, civil wars, it lacked a traditional king, or Oba, and was thus ruled by a ballet. It literally means father of the land, Babaile. Yet the mechanism of deposition by the Ogboni was the same as it would be for a king. With characteristic exaggeration, Frobenius portrays Ibadan's leader as serving at the society's whim, commanded to commit suicide at the slightest display of autonomy, further promoting the dubious claim that, quote, it is not so very long ago that every ballet who had served his statutory 2 years of office was murdered in conformity with the laws of a very ancient ritual. Interesting, he's suggesting pretty much what Sir James Frazer writes when he says that the actual divine kings were killed on a very regular short-term basis. I don't know whether Frobenius believes this. He's certainly writing in an exoticist register to his European audience. They were not murdered every 2 years. Nobody in their right mind would go into a political office that only gave them 2 years to live, I don't think. And in any case, it's an exaggeration. But it also is consistent with the model of Ogboni deposition, of its capacity to take out a ruler who violates the limits of high office. For Frobenius, ritual sacrifice and murder were not only touchstones of Yoruba cultural authenticity, but also provided an avenue for getting him there. Difficult as it is to separate his overweening rhetoric from the actual events he describes, there is no question that after investing heavily in the Ogboni leadership, Frobenius, along with Arians and Martius, arranged a proxy initiation in something like a package deal. In one of the strangest passages in the history of ethnological writing, I quote, "A final agreement was arrived at by which not we, the Europeans, were to partake of the bloody consecrated wafer at the altar, but that a black man should be our substitute." That's very important. A black man should be our substitute. "And that the ceremony should be performed in my own house in secret with closed doors. That very same evening, the not particularly aesthetic rite was celebrated in our hall by the light of our lanterns. It was an uncanny and in its own way sinister business. Naturally, it was not carried out in all its details, because in recent times, ducklings, and he really means chickens, have taken the place of hitherto customary human victims. What follows in his text is a detailed account drawn from descriptions which we learned Frobenius, quote, had collected years ago on the Edon Ogboni on which human sacrificial blood originally was poured, the shouting of Epa by officiating elders, the placement of a red kola nut in the blood on the ground, which the blindfolded neophyte must stretch out, pick up, and ingest with his mouth while on all fours, the use of Edon spikes, those spikes at the bottom of the statues, of the images, the bronze images, to transfer the blood to other parts of the body through a kind of sympathetic contact, and how in the past, if the candidate, the initiate, was wealthy and had many slaves, quote, as many as 10 people would be butchered on this occasion. What are we to make of this fast-tracked initiation into the secret mysteries and networks of the Ogboni Society? Was it a sham performance staged by elders who were seizing the moment to fleece some Europeans? Or did it confer at least some diluted privileges in proportion to the corners cut? Did shifting the location from the Ogboni Lodge to Frobenius' personal domicile compromise, if not fully violate, the felicity conditions of the initiation's efficacy? And what of the 2 proxy substitutions of the African for 3 European neophytes and the decapitated ducklings, chickens, for a human sacrifice, substituting that? Could the intended recipients of the earth cult's ashe still connect to the source along such attenuated symbolic ties? Or did the double surrogation, the African for Frobenius and then the chicken for the human, strip them from their ritual moorings? To my very big surprise, Karl Arien's remarkable illustration of this event includes important details indicating that the initiation was more than a mere charade or charade. And on the left, this is a very, in my mind, a very important image because it's so accurate. When I first came across this drawing on the left, it's actually, I think it's either a watercolor or chalk, I can't remember. I took this photograph myself down in the archive from the original. I was so captivated by the original. I came across this drawing. It was only months after my own Ogboni initiation during my first return to visit to Ayede in 1990, a full 6 years after my dissertation fieldwork had ended. Unlike Frobenius' experience, which he strategically engineered, the Ogboni elders unexpectedly came to me, and I was honored to accept. Because among other things, as far as Yoruba are concerned, as far as the official ideology of Ogboni is that you have to prove that you have good character. And it's when I returned that they realized I was sincere. They were always having kind of a question mark during the long periods of research. But then when I returned with gifts and years later, then they said, okay, this guy is moral. So I was kind of happy about that. Nor did it all come together in a single evening, the way it did for Frobenius. It involved advanced purchases and a prolonged liminal waiting period marked by a 3-cowrie bracelet worn on the left wrist that blocked my entry into some disapproving Christian households. They claim not to know what it is, but they won't let you in the door. What is that on your wrist? Oh, it's just it's culture, ashani, just the very thing that they used to tell me. And it was like, aha, weibo, kilon what's the matter with you? And get out of here. So they know damn well what's going on, excuse me. So what astonished me about Arien's rendition of the ceremony, however, was how much it resembled the denouement, the high point of my own experience, when blindfolded and stripped to my skivvies inside the lodge. I too crawled like an animal, eranco, and I also had to grub directly with my mouth, ingesting similar sacrificial kola nuts, along with a few other offerings, also sprinkled with rooster blood and a little bit of of the raw meat attached to. Other similarities with the illustration include the Igmi drum on the right. That is a Ogboni drum, very characteristic, not used for any other ritual. Its own rhythms, very separate from the Orisha rhythms. Although Orisha ceremonies will incorporate those rhythms in certain contexts. And also the use of the Edan Mole, or the Edan Ogboni. This is a close-up here of the scene on the left. And what you see here in a slightly plastic idiom is the decapitated rooster's head and the blood flowing onto the Edan. And that's an important detail, because that's the channel of Ashe, and without that, the power doesn't get transferred, and it gets planted into the earth. So there's a whole circuit of Ashe, some of which comes from the earth, upward into the body, and others which comes from the blood of the chicken and goes downwards into the earth. So at a time in anthropology, in 1990, when all traditions seemed to be invented, I don't know if in Germany the Hobsbawm and Ranger volume, The Invention of Tradition, initiated a kind of a paradigm change in the way we think of rituals. Everything became invented. So at a time when everything seemed invented, the ritual continuities of Ogboni initiations, evidenced by an 80-year-old description. So Frobenius got initiated in 1910. My own was in 1990, so it's perfect 80-year period. That was difficult for me to fathom. And it's the only image I have. This is a preliminary, and I've never shown it in a lecture before, ever. I'd be laughed off the block. I don't like going the whole idea of, it's so easy to misunderstand this stuff for a public, but I know you guys have it, you can appreciate the perspective, which is that it's up to them, it's not up to me, right? In any case, this is the cleansing period, before I had to strip down to my underpants and then have the blindfold put on my head and do pretty much what he describes. I mean, it's just phenomenal. So whether or not his initiation was truly effective in local terms, Frobenius himself was still not satisfied. And it appears that he found what he wanted to find. On the 13th of November, 1910, not long after his initiation, in his writing, he says he learns of a particularly gruesome ritual murder near Ibadan's main market, where the thorax, one leg, and one arm of the victim were recovered. After informing the relevant authorities in Ibadan, including the acting resident, the district commissioner, and the medical officer, of this particularly gruesome, quote-unquote, incident, all of whom preferred to turn a blind eye, Frobenius embarked on his own investigation with suspiciously fortuitous results. So he goes on. This ritual murder, tragic as it was, brought me into immediate contact with the religious life of the Yoruba. I had satisfied my sense of duty and had put the government of the country on the track. The neglect of taking it up was their own business. In other words, he gave them the chance to pursue this, but they chose not to investigate. For my part, I followed it until I had almost reached its source. During those days, I sometimes felt as if I was not playing an ethnologist's, but a detective's part. At times, my activities were far from being pleasant, and I had to keep my eyes firmly fixed on my objective, so as not to get sick of all the secret inquiry and fishing in troubled waters. But I got to the very wellspring of ritual murder. Now I was in a position to insist upon my rights as an Ogboni leaguer, and my astonished and outwitted colleagues realized that not only was I a legitimized initiate, but entitled to further information. In short, my descriptive ethnological work was now on foot, and I soon learned everything I wanted to know without much difficulty. I mean, do you understand what this passage is saying? Because when I first read it, I couldn't believe it. I thought, wait, what? What? I don't know how many of you have picked this up who work in the Frobenius-Institut, but what he's basically saying is that there really was a real human being killed on his behalf, because you can't initiate anyone into Ogboni without a human sacrifice. So he's basically saying, I am legitimate because there really was a real person killed on my behalf. But he says it in such an indirect way that it's very easy to miss. The first time I read this, It went right by my head. That's what he's saying. It's kind of amazing. So here we identify the smoking knife, connecting ritual murder to Frobenius' Yoruba archive, textually attested not only by the ritual objects of his growing collection, but more importantly, by the very cultural categories which quickly coalesced. Quote, "The spell was broken. Basket after basket of my collection was produced, unpacked, and its contents discussed item by item. Everything belonging to the same category was sorted out. Every wrong description was erased and corrected. Everything fell into its proper place. As soon as any given section had been properly arranged, connected, and completed, off it went to the draftsman's department, where Arians, at once the artist, set it down in his sketchbooks with unflagging energy." So I want to draw attention to, first of all, the fact that the logic of a cultural system becomes clear to him after the murder, and also part of the documentation process, in addition to writing obviously annotated field notes on each object, is to create images of them. So we have a visual archive complementing the textual archive, and if you go down to the basement over there, that's exactly what you find. The images are phenomenal, they're beautiful, they're works of art, but they're also works of ethnology. Frobenius' archive of Yoruba culture is shaped by the specialized knowledge of the Ogboni elders, whose explications transformed the unruly and contradictory explanations he had earlier received into nothing less than a systematic theology, what he calls a grand socio-religious system of the profoundly philosophical native, and also special forms of civilization as its mysteries were laid bare. Frobenius takes pains to emphasize how his newly acquired initiatory knowledge conferred unprecedented insight into a particular African culture during his expeditions up to that point, proclaiming, "Although my diaries may contain many imperfect and erroneous descriptions of mythological details," and I'm actually impressed by how much they get right, which are therefore unconnected, yet that which I did actually discover is more clearly defined than anything my studies of African national life hitherto offered me. So obviously he still has something like, how many expeditions did he have in total? 10, 11, 12? 12. So he still has 8 expeditions coming in the future. But up to this point, he's saying nothing equals what I have here. But why? Because he never had that initiatory advantage in any of the other work. Once properly initiated via the enabling fiction of a ritual murder, or maybe it's not a fiction, Frobenius could embark upon the road to knowledge. As his, quote, runnel of information increased in volume, a runnel is a small stream. I didn't know that. I'm learning my own language in these translations. He could now organize it into an archive of Yoruba culture and catalog the monumental majesty of its historic past. But the Pilgrim's Progress would not go unchallenged. Proceeding from Ibadan to the city of Ile-Ife, the origin of sacred kingship and community in Yoruba creation myths, Frobenius pushed deeper into protected territory, this time turning the tables against himself via a second fateful substitution. So what I'm trying to show is that the genesis of his Yoruba archive depended upon a ritual initiation. When I started this lecture series, I said I'm not so much interested in distinguishing or contrasting ritual archives from official archives, but actually building a continuous line between them, such that on the one hand, at one extreme, you have shrines and spirit possession as an archival mode of storing and of accessing the past. On the other extreme, you have the most official archives that still have ritual aspects to them. And this is a case among other cases. It's not typical of all of them, but this is an example of how an archive, an academic archive housed in a wonderful university itself has this kind of secret bloodletting underneath it, and sacrifice and substitution. And again, you might want to ask me, well, how do you distinguish between what he says happened and what actually happened? I'm putting that on hold for a moment. Substitutions and reversals in the Olokun affair. This is the second. I just want to get a sense of, I have read a little bit. Put mildly, the so-called Olokun affair is something of a scandal in the chronicles of European cultural plunder in Africa. reanimated by current debates over repatriating ritual arts to their homelands. Like the priceless Benin bronzes seized by the British earlier, the Olokun head, as it is called, is a Yoruba bronze that has now become iconic of both the high naturalism of ancient Ife art, likely produced in the 12th or 13th or maybe 14th century, and the low levels to which Europeans stooped to appropriate sacred arts in the colonies for their metropolitan museums. The vectors of extraction are complicated in this case by the fact that Frobenius was working in a British colony at a time when the scramble for Africa, still included Germany, which occupied nearby Togoland to the west and German Cameroon to the east. As we shall see, to the east of Nigeria, that is. As we shall see, Frobenius's prodigious collecting up to that point ran up against two spheres of sovereign authority. One would be called traditional authority, that of the Oni of Ife, who, primus inter pares, first among equals, among the traditional Yoruba Obas, he reigned supreme, and that of the colony and protectorate of southern Nigeria, represented by the acting resident in Ibadan, Frobenius's nemesis, Mr. Charles Partridge. So these are the two sources of sovereignty that he had to navigate and pushed back. Moreover, these two spheres themselves were in the early stages of structural alignment as the administrative system of indirect rule in the north expanded southward and was formally consolidated in 1914 by Lord Lugard, Sir Frederick Lugard. Frobenius's expedition to Ile-Ife met with predictable resistance when he arrived to pay respects to the Oni of Ife and requested permission to purchase and excavate ritual artifacts, particularly the legendary terracotta heads that he had already heard of in Hamburg. And I put this image down, which comes in the book, because it shows quite nicely that organizing an audience with the Oni of Ife is not a joke. It's highly ceremonious. And this is, I don't actually know if this was a representative speaking on behalf of Frobenius or whether it's just a sketch of another messenger or courtier coming to approach the Oni of Ife. But you can see he's sitting in state. He's not wearing a beaded fringe, but he's wearing a crown nonetheless. Beaded crown, and the first thing you do when you greet an Oba is if you're a male, you prostrate, dobale. If you're a female, you kind of curtsy in a kunle, and you would say something like Kabiesi, Oluwo, Akin Pupo, Adeakwe Lori, Batakbelese. Your Highness, we greet you greatly. May your crown stay long on your head. May your slippers stay long on your feet. Which means, may you stay in office, right? Because the insignia of office are merging with the person of the incumbent. And then things start rolling. And for Frobenius, initial negotiations produced what he says, Frobenius says, became broken promises, evasive answers, and then also modern ritual objects of inferior quality, which Frobenius associated with the decline and degeneration of the once glorious Yoruba civilization, whose artistic works he sought with unflagging determination. Frobenius and Spengler had a actual correspondence, and Frobenius really bought into this notion of a decline of civilizations. A lot of people did at that time, but you can read from his account that Frobenius wants at least to see what some of the really powerful, important ritual objects are, and he had the feeling that he was just being shown a bunch of sort of cheap knockoffs, as we would say today. Frobenius had heard of an arsenal of treasure in the sacred grove of the Olokun deity, located deep in the bush, associated with the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Keeping with his prefabricated theory that the Yoruba civilization of the past was the lost city of Atlantis, he typically dubbed the deity Poseidon Olokun, merging the Greek. Bear in mind that the first account of Atlantis comes from Timaeus and a couple of other citations in Plato, Plato's Socratic Dialogues and the Republic. So what he's doing here is introducing a figure of ancient Euro-African origins, Poseidon Greek and Olokun African, which his excavations would purportedly bring to light. Hence the importance of eventually receiving the Oni's permission to dig in the Alokan Grove during one of their talks, or at least Frobenius claimed. And here is where the archaeological raiding began in earnest, as his team delved ever deeper for the treasures of the past beneath the ground. And this became a controversial issue in the inquest against Frobenius, is did he actually get this permission? And it sounds like he had a conference, a meeting with the Oni of Ife, and the Oni has to obey protocol and be cooperative, but didn't want to give him permission, but gave enough of an indication that he could do some stuff. By dint of this wonderful energy, he writes, Frobenius writes, in conducting the operations, Martius succeeded in getting some very important results in spite of our inadequate tools, merely simple implements of tillage in native use, and the fewness of our workmen notwithstanding. He led his little troop of 5 or 6 to Poseidon's Grove, calls it Poseidon's Grove, every morning, and put them to digging and scratching and shoveling, clearing away the soil himself while burying deeper and deeper still. I had a shaft driven beneath the roots of an old giant tree at a spot where, as far as could be seen, there had been no previous digging. We also dug in an already existing shaft until both of them were about 15 feet in depth, connected them by a transverse gallery, and then from the levels of the shafts drove 2 more galleries in the direction of the tree, which met at some 17 feet below the surface. Then Martius went still further down. So there are many things going on here. You can see this as a kind of invasive penetration of sacred soil. You can see it as almost like a mining expedition. But the real significance, he's going deeper than anybody had gone. And there's this homology between stratigraphic archaeological depth and historical depth and ritual depth. Familiar themes of European conquest, ingenuity, and penetration echo throughout this passage, describing the expedition's violation of sacred ground, but particularly notable is how its engineered architecture of subterranean descent achieves unprecedented levels of depth into the past, establishing a sanctified baseline from which its relics could be recovered. And here's an image of this, and it's actually an interesting image. Here you have the first level, and you can see here what this actually is a rope going up, and they have a bucket, and Frobenius is examining the quality of one of the artworks discovered, and they're going to stick it in this bucket and send it up. Here we have more excavations nearby, but then there's this other lower level down below where objects are being brought up. So you really get a sense of a systematic discovery procedure. And these layers pass through a lot of broken glazed pottery, reddish-brown in color, blocks of weather-beaten stone at 10 feet down, followed by ashes and beads associated with Yoruba crowns and ritual iconography, the beaded crown, and then which were 6 or 7 feet further below. And these antiquities that were recovered included naturalistic terracotta heads of Ife fame, but not the coveted Olokun statue that would soon appear under other circumstances. So I just want to show you some of the terracotta that did appear, and they're beautiful objects. This is what he called the Mia sculpture on the right. And what's interesting about the way he organizes these terracottas on the left is that they seem to confirm his hypothesis of degeneration in racial phenotypical terms. So you have this great civilization represented by Caucasian features and a kind of naturalist aesthetic, which was believed to only be from a Western heritage. Africans weren't capable of that, but obviously in this ancient period they were. But then it proceeds to what he would call more Negroid characteristics. And this is a very problematic reading, obviously, but it supports his theory. That's the point. So from his detailed recounting of the events that followed, it becomes clear that Frobenius was closely monitored by the Oni's lieutenant messengers, or Ilari, who consistently steered him astray from the very finds that, under the Oni's authority, they were directed to enable. So he feels like he's being constantly discouraged from going into what he considered to be the real deal. After one such staged disclosure of a very bad piece of work, quote unquote, during his search for the Olocum bronze, Frobenius resorted to bribery, offering the Olocum priest and his son, who were in the Ife Grove, a sweet bonus if they could lead him to the genuine article. Meeting up with them later in the Olocum Grove shrine, he and Martius finally beheld the long-sought key to Yoruba culture. Before us stood a head of marvelous beauty, wonderfully cast in antique bronze, true to the life, encrusted with a patina of glorious dark green. This was, in very deed, the Olocum, Atlantic Africa's Poseidon. And this is a photograph of the exalted image. Now, Frobenius's prize was literally within his reach, but at the time, the Oni's security had caught up with them, his guards, his Ilari, and they were visibly annoyed, and they informed him that the Olocum head was usually kept underground at the place of its discovery, and that it was only brought out during sacrifices for festivals, at festival time, and it should not be sold. And here it was already being exposed in a kind of violation of sacred seclusion. But a second bribe followed to turn the tables once more. Pulling one of the Ilari, one of the security detailed officers of the Oni, Frobenius proposed, sotto voce, how would he like a handsome gift? Avarice gleamed in his eyes. I asked him if the old priest was entitled to sell me the head. Yes, he said. I told him that if he wished me to give him a large present in cash after I had actually got it, he would have to help me get it. This completely bowled him over. It was agreed that Bida, which is the name of his assistant, although it's also the name of the capital of Nupe land from which he comes, should accompany him to the priestly dotard's son that very same evening. So Frobenius' translator, Bida, and the Ilari returned with a set of conditions for sale. So a long story short, I'm going to summarize because I think time is running out, is he proposed a number of gifts, a bottle of spirits, and 120 shillings, 6 pounds, to purchase it. That was the terms of the deal that were finally accepted. But another condition by the Ilari would prove crucial to what followed, namely that a new copy of the head would be made at the tinsmiths, presumably to replace the original. This presumption is reinforced by the final condition of transfer, that the priest and his family, and this is very interesting, they had to make a sacrifice to it the next day and unsanctify it, so to say, and then send it on. So this shows very clearly, even though Frobenius is the one describing it and has motives perhaps for not, he's acknowledging that you can't sell a sacred object, but you can perform a ritual to desanctify it. It's a very practical culture, Yoruba. Oh, you want to buy something that you can't be sold? Well, if we just do a sacrifice, we can convert it back into a non-sacred object. We'll be safe. The deity won't hurt us for selling it, and you'll have what you want. And so the last condition, once again, points to the sanctified status of ritually charged cult icons as inalienable possessions that are insulated from the sphere of commercial exchange. And so they did this to avoid retaliation. But even after doing that, the priest's family backed out. Sorry about this, I just have to rush. So they back out of the deal, and what follows is a kind of surreptitious exhumation. They managed to bribe 2 of the sons who took them to where the object was buried at night, and they dug it up. He chips a piece off the Olocum head when he's bringing it up, and this becomes a sign of a kind of, crude excavation techniques, if nothing else. But he was rejoicing, and I won't read you this because it will take too long. But the trouble started immediately. Word got back to the Oni of Ife, who then called or got in touch with the district officer and the resident in Ibadan, and at that point, Frobenius was blocked from departing from Ife with all of his art objects, and the art objects were actually seized, and he had to defend himself in a commission of inquiry. These are some of the people in this is the dreaded Charles Partridge, who actually, I actually think I've followed up a little bit on his own collection, which is some of his archival stuff is in the British Museum, is that he really was trying to protect the local king, the Oni of Ife, to keep the ritual sacred objects from being disturbed. But Frobenius is convinced that he's jealous of Frobenius' own success in getting this stuff, and there's some truth to that, because some of the things that Frobenius did ultimately collect and then had to give back turned up in England. So there's plenty of blame to go around everywhere. And these are some of of his workers who he claims were turncoats. And this is one of the local police. And he describes how there's loyal servants are loyal only until somebody pays them more. That kind of discourse. But basically the point is that Frobenius defends himself by saying there was a misunderstanding and that the Olocum, that he understood that he could keep the original and make a galvanized copy, which were of high quality in those days. And the Oni said no, he could have the copy, but he was buying the rights to make a copy, but we would keep the original. And then ultimately Frobenius blames his translator on mistranslating, and the long story short, all of his stuff is confiscated. It's sent up to the resident and the governor general of the colony, who basically agrees to give back most of the collection and to retain the most sacred pieces for the Oni. And then they kind of banish him from Ife, and he goes off to the north to a town called Mokwa, where the reports are that he's not causing any trouble. There's much more here, and there are many more vectors of extraction and of circulation that I go into, but don't have time here. So I'm concluding now. The Olocum affair has had many afterlives, including an elaborate heist of the presumed original from a collector in Brazil by none other than Wole Soyinka in his valiant effort to reclaim stolen cultural patrimony. And he would learn from the British experts at the British Museum that it too was a copy. So he went all this way to Bahia to grab what he thought was a stolen original, and then finds out that it was actually not an original either. But the afterlife I'm more concerned with is less about original objects and more about the signs that they leave behind. In this case, the documentary record of traces, text artifacts, and images that are indexically and iconically related to the cultural antiquities that were sold, stored, exhibited, or in radically accusatory cases, stolen. As Edita Plata noted, the celebrated Ife bronze Olocum enjoys an ongoing career as an inclusive Yoruba cultural icon. And I would argue also that Frobenius' privileging of this object played a role in expanding the Yoruba ethnonym, the name Yoruba, beyond its limited Oyo boundaries in the 19th century into the pan-Yoruba category of his scholarship as a civilization. And today, this notion subsumes all of the Yoruba-speaking subcultural groups like the Egba, the Egbado, the Ijesha, the Ekiti that I work among, Akoko, Ijebu, Owo, etc. All of these mythically dispersed from Ile-Ife. But the iconic image has also been incorporated into the University of Ife's, now the Obafemi Awolowo University, renamed, official logo, where it doubles through visual montage as a sacred text of learning. It's a kind of interesting image on the upper left, because the icon of the Olocum head is here, beneath. The text is for learning and culture, so we're taking deep knowledge and turning it into so-called development. But the text on the head is extremely interesting. It's, on the one hand, it represents literacy and book learning, as some rural Nigerians would call it, book learning. But it also invokes sacred texts, the religions of the book of Islam and Christianity, so it becomes a unifying visual trope. But I also want to draw attention to the morphology of the book as a double-edged hatchet. It's like the Shango staff, It's the double-headed axe that, and for those of you who don't know, Shango is also the Orisha of lightning. And enlightenment, the knowledge coming from the book, is also like a lightning connected to Shango's more, rhyming, I would say, with the image of a Shango staff, Oshe Shango, this is called. And again, I don't know if the artists were aware of this or whether it was kind of an overdetermined aesthetic correlation or whether they did choose to do this. I'm putting these two images together. So this image then, if you think of Walter Benjamin and the work of art in the age of mechanical, or in this case, nowadays, digital reproduction, you can see how the image proliferates. It just runs around. So it also, it proliferates as a popular image for modern reproductions and mass-produced paraphernalia, almost like miniature Michelangelos or Eiffel Towers in the secondary symbolic economies of the tourist spaces. And it is these fetishistic splits between original and copy, between what Walter Benjamin calls cult value and reproductive commodity value, which itself is embedded in sign value, or between what in another context Achille Mbembe calls the thing and its doubles, that objectified Frobenius' archive of Yoruba culture. We have already gleaned from Frobenius' own account how his access to the secrets of Yoruba culture and civilization during his fourth inter-African expedition, which Jan Heitz Jan ranks as the most successful journey of them all, rested on his proxy initiation into the Ogboni society and the forbidden sacrifice of a human victim, which he suspected and allegedly tracked down. It was only thereafter that his chaotic material, we've seen, fell neatly into place according to an inner logic that structured the categories of his nascent cultural archive and was also sanctified by blood and ritually enabled by his privileged access to Ogboni cult knowledge. But if the proxy initiation opened the Yoruba archive, the Olokun affair provided two kinds of closure. The first quite disastrous, leading to the loss of his most treasured pieces, effectively closing the Yoruba leg of his trip as he was banished northwards to Mokwa, but also paradoxically consolidating the archive as its documentary doubles took precedence over the originals. Defending himself in the Hamburger Nachrichten, I guess that's the newspaper, 4 months after the court proceedings in Ife, which had generated negative international coverage, Frobenius underscored the silver lining, the good part of his recent misfortune. Our happiness, he writes, had reached a climax when we came to Ife and found in the depths of the earth those treasures that verified the incalculable age and classical depth of this culture. Jealous and brutal envy on the part of the acting resident, the British acting resident, snatched the greatest part away from us. But the facts are clear, held safe in our archive, in ink, lead, paint, and pen, as well as in photographs. So that's his language. Here we see the Yoruba archive emerging as a named repository of material signs, ink, lead, paint, indexing facts and iconic images that represent the truth value of Yoruba culture as an object domain of ethnological knowledge, such that the doubles take control over their things. Presiding over this eminent cultural domain looms the Poseidon Olokun head, bringing the lost Yoruba Atlantis into contemporary view, while serving as a visual macrotrope of all that it contained, the master key to the archive itself. Further animating this archive was Frobenius' theory of culture as a life force of an organic being, with its own distinctive morphology and paidoima, roughly equivalent to a Geist-like essence, the documentation of which belonged to his larger Lebenswerk, in which all records of sources, ordered and arranged by an inner logic, are stored for the study of cultural history, I'm quoting, in a comprehensive archive of ethnology and history of civilization. And this comes from another publication of his early on when he was still young. And it is this larger project that is currently housed in the Frobenius-Institut. Today, I have focused on the particular ritual history of Frobenius' Yoruba archive, a subset of the larger whole, concluding a larger argument linking ritual archives as primary historical sources to a valuable ethnographic resource predicated on human sacrifice and the symbolic reversal of a potent ritual object and its iconic double. Thank you.